Kia ora mai tātou e hui hui mai nei, e rungi te kaupapa tō rānei, me ki, ngā kōrero rero, e rungi te kaupapa o tai ao tāngata hauora, Advancing Planetary Health. He moka puna tēnei a Ngāti Manipoto, Waikato Tainui, me Ngāti Whananga, ko te Hikuroa tōko ingoa. Tēnei te mihi nui ki ngā kai kōrero, e kōrero tū ana, me ngā kai arehi, mo te pua te kaupapa o te rā. So just thanking and acknowledging those who have spoken before me and acknowledging the organiser of this conference. I'm honoured to be invited to speak at this kaupapa, and I'll do my best to maybe build on some of the things you've already covered so far in this hui, and then perhaps even expand some of your understandings. Having a look at the program, I could see that Māori has featured heavily already, and in fact we will cover off aspects of Māori as well in my kōrero. And first, actually, I want to start with the title. Toitū te marae a Tāne, Toitū te marae o Tangaroa, Toitū te iwi. And this is a whakatauki, miki, whakatauki, perhaps a proverb of saying, meaning that if the land and the sea are well, then the people will be well also. And so that's a very, very Māori way of seeing the world. It's a very, very Indigenous way of seeing the world. And that framing comes from both a mātauranga Māori base, and we'll explore that just a little bit, as well as that Māori worldview. And then I'll go into some practical understandings of what it might mean for this planetary health with respect to Māori and mātauranga. So, mātauranga Māori. I'm sure many of you here will be very familiar with what it is. Some of you may be slightly less so, but just a real brief overview. Mātauranga Māori, inclusive of Māori knowledge, but also our culture, our values, and underpinned by a Māori worldview. And of course, a Māori worldview sees us as being a part of nature, not apart from nature. I think that's one of those fundamental understandings that's quite critical for us to start exploring when it comes to understanding tai ao, tangata and hauora, and this planetary health framing. And so, mātauranga, many forms we know of with our oral tradition are things like pūrākau, pūkōrero, our waiata, our oriori, our whaikōrero, those oral forms of knowledge that are ever so rich and extremely accurate and precise and tested through time. This is also, I hope, another example for you of what mātauranga Māori can look like in the more tangible form, in the shape of this whare. This is umutahi marae and umutahi whare of umutahi marae in Matata. Now, I need to be clear, I don't whakapapa to this place, but I have permission of the Marae Committee to use this image for education and kōrero purposes. And so, of course, the knowledge here is in the shape of the design. This is absolutely classic, whare design. You'll find it throughout ngā motu. And then there are the materials that we use to construct our whare nui, our whare whakairo, our whare moi. Although they can vary in between different iwi and hapu, particularly in the regions where you have different trees, but each of the trees selected would have specific purposes in mind, whether it be for the exterior cladding or whether it be for kind of the stress bearing elements of the potoko manawa, the central pole, and maybe the tāhuhu, the central backbone in the whare. That's all knowledge around which trees to select and which are the appropriate ones. Of course, we have other materials that they're in, the tuku panels, maybe the kia that's used for those with the raupo. And then we have the knowledge that sits behind the ochres that would have traditionally been used. These, of course, being the colours of Papa Tuanuku, our Earth Mother, the reds, the blacks and the whites. And there is knowledge that comes from either where you collect those in that form. Say, for example, the black can come from anoxic environments such as swamps or estuaries. And the white might come from things like altered rhyolite rocks or orange geothermal areas. Nevertheless, the key point I'm making here is that mātauranga exists in the tangible form as well as the oral form. And then there's maybe one more layer of mātauranga that I'll talk about here, which is actually of particular relevance for today. both in the contemporary setting and also I think for this conference, for the conference in TT setting, is actually where you build your marae and the knowledge that sits behind information of where to build, but maybe more importantly, where not to build. And as we're seeing this year with extreme weather events, floods, superimposed with sea level rise, it's of real importance that our infrastructure, if we want to use that term, or our marae, our whare and builder places, that we know to be safe based on our previous knowledge. Now, I need to make one caveat here, in that our state of knowing comes from what we've seen and experienced. If, as we move forward, we start to see more extreme events, such as the like we've never seen before, then that might be where the mātauranga might be found wanting. But in general, so far, we appear to be holding up fairly well. So the key thing about all knowledge, in fact, is that it's underpinned by a worldview. And whānau, we all have one. Every single one of us, you here today, in fact, all of us will have a worldview. What we regard to be real, possible, and impossible. And the key thing is that there is a dominant worldview in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's become so dominant, I suppose, that it becomes almost invisible. And it's only people who have different worldviews to that dominant one that are kind of seen, because it's not part of the mainstream one. And I need to be clear, I'm not making any value judgments on people's worldviews or what they are. I'm merely pointing out that we have worldviews, and the person next to you will have a worldview, and it might be very similar, it might be exactly the same, or it might be a little bit different, or it might be wildly different. The key thing is that it's important for us to keep in mind when we're looking at and trying to make sense of, or trying to come to understanding of things, or trying to implement programs or ideas and understand values, our worldview is our underpinning aspect of that. What does that actually look like, Dave? Remember this time? Fun, and we have a bit of a chuckle about that now. So, oh gosh, how silly. But, for a time, this was real. This was what was believed. And it was only until such time as that the earth was circumnavigated that this was proven to be wrong. And so with new information and new knowledge come new realities. I had an example about where my worldview was really quite strong. And if you've ever had a situation where you found yourself saying, oh, I couldn't believe my eyes. Probably it's not that your eyes are broken. It's just that what you're seeing doesn't align with what your worldview accepts to be real. And so here's my example. I was leading a field trip down in a national park, and I had a group of students visiting from overseas, and we were talking about kaitiakitanga and mātauranga Māori, and it was part of an earth and environmental science program. And we'd been there for a few days, and the weather had been a bit inclement. And finally I said, oh, look, the skies have cleared, whānau. Maybe we'll go outside and we'll look at the night sky. And what I want you to look for is things that are similar, and things that are different, and things that are new. I said, oh, and keep an eye out for satellites as well. Oh, how will we know what a satellite looks like? Oh, it's just like a star, but just tracks slowly across the night sky. Okay. And a few of the eager ones rushed outside, and I was picking up a conversation with some of the other students who were still picking up on the mātauranga. And then as we were walking out, I reflected upon this later. It wasn't really a conscious thing, but I heard a few of the students saying, hey, there's Orion's bell, but it's upside down, and there's this, and oh my gosh, what's that one? Is that the Southern Cross? And then someone exclaimed, hey, there's a satellite, and another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. And look, I remember I had one ear listening on this corridor with the students on the mātauranga. And I was also thinking with my other ear, oh my goodness. I said, goodness knows what they're seeing. In all my years of looking at satellites, I've only ever seen maybe 3 or 4 at once in the night sky. But I got out there and this is what I saw. And whānau, I could not believe my eyes. Now, to be clear, it wasn't that my eyes were broken, far from it. It's just that what my eyes were seeing didn't equate with what, at that time, I believed to be real or even possible. Now, yes, of course, a quick Google search, and we discovered this was SpaceX, it was Elon Musk and his chains of satellites. They're going to revolutionize the world. The point being is that for myself, and in fact, many of the students, who actually some of them were quite freaked out, that what we saw didn't equate with what we believed to be real, and some of the students really began to think about some really crazy kind of scenarios. And so that's the power of our worldview. It's strong enough to act at a subconscious level to tell us that our eyes are broken. And I think that's something really powerful and helpful for us to bear in mind as we start to think about what kinds of knowledges and ways of knowing and being and doing might we look to tap into as we seek the aspirations of what all of us here for this kōrero and this conference are about. And so that brings to bear this idea of knowledges, the idea that there's more than one way of knowing something. And even though we might be looking at this, we might be relating to it, making sense of it different. So if we were here in person, I'd get a bit interactive. I'd say, hey, so what have we got here? So I've done this before, so I'll tell you what some of the questions are. Usually it's a really weird look. It's like, well, clearly it's a whale. Of course it is, but there's some whale enthusiasts and they know their whales and they say this is a humpback whale. And this is a scientific name. It's a large winged New Englander, Megaptera novanglia, named after large pectoral fin and been sighted off the coast of New England, despite the fact that this whale, of course, was found, around the world. But for others, this whale is an ancestor. And for some groups, there's a particular name for this whale, the humpback whale. For them, it is Paikea. And so the key thing there is that the question isn't who's right and who's wrong. The question is, how do we learn from both of those ways of knowing and being and relating to this thing in order that we might seek better ways of doing and understanding, particularly as we come to understand the impacts that humans are having upon the taiao and how it's manifesting in the whole order of people. So here's another example of worldview. Hopefully, if all the pedagogy of teaching is correct, here's what you might have just experienced, and hopefully it is, because we can't get interactive. Because our eyes and brains are really good at recognising patterns, hopefully your eyes would have recognised this as a pattern of New Zealand, but that it's flipped upside down, and then your cognition might have jumped in, and you probably thought, oh, ka aroha, and there's been some formatting issue here. Dear me, his image is up the wrong way. And then your eyes would have actually picked up, that, oh no, there's words there, and the words are up the right way. And then maybe you started honing in on a particular word that appears quite a lot in this image, and that's the word Maui. So this is an alignment of Aotearoa New Zealand, consistent with the Maui pūrākau, talking about how he fishes up the North Island of New Zealand, and then how his waka became the South Island. And because Te Upoko o Te Ika, the head of the fish, is in Wellington, conceptually, Māori view New Zealand this way up, with the head aligned to the up, and then the tail to the down. And I actually remember as a child, my uncle saying, "Oh, we're going to go up to Wellington this weekend." You go, "Oh, we're going to go down to Whangarei," from the context of Auckland. I actually thought they were having me on. I thought they were teasing me, and it wasn't until years later that I actually realised that actually no, that was living the perspective of Aotearoa in alignment with the Māori worldview, with a Māori worldview. There are more than one. So the key thing there is that it's still unmistakably New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand. It's just a way of relating to it is ever so slightly different, drawn from that mātauranga base. And so the key thing about mātauranga and about Māori ways of knowing and being and doing is so strongly bound in whakapapa. And whakapapa is both in a human sense, a genealogy, but it also explains the world and how the world was created. And because everything we see in the taiao and up in the rangi, up in the sky, comes from the primal parents, Rangi Nui and Papa Toanaku, everything is interconnected and everything is interrelated in a kinship-based way. And so that is a very, very widespread Māori worldview, that we are linked from this world. In fact, many of the stories say that we are the last born. And so we are, therefore, everything else is our elder. And in the culture of Māori, you revere and look after your elders. And so in that framing, these ideas of kaitiakitanga spring forth. Kaitiakitanga being a sense of responsibility for your kin, and a sense of responsibility for your elders. And so whilst within that we have user privileges of resources of te marae or Tangaroa, of te marae or Tāne, we never had ownership rights of those things. We had user privileges, but with those came those responsibilities. And one of the key aspects in which we understand the health and well-being of te marae or Tāne, of te marae or Tangaroa, of hauora of people is in Māori. Now, I know you've heard a little bit about Māori already. I'm just going to spend a couple of slides talking about, maybe adding to your understandings. So here is an image of the Tarawera River in the headwaters, and I'm hoping, and this is based on previous presentations where I've showed this image, and I just ask, how's the Māori of this river? People usually say it looks pretty good. The water's pretty clear. Now you've got native vegetation coming all the way down. There's a little bit of algae in the water, and a little bit of algae is good Māori. It shows that it's healthy. And so there's a consensus that, yeah, the Māori of this is pretty good. And you go down on its short 65-kilometre journey, and this is the Tarawera River where it flows out, into the Te Moana Nui Atoi, the Bay of Plenty. And well, when I ask people the same question, they say, "Oh, no, the Māori of that river isn't as good as it was. In fact, it might be pretty poor." Now, we could use the instruments of science to do all sorts of measurements to tell us what the difference is. But whilst that would be helpful and useful, they would only be confirming what we intuitively sensed, was that the Māori of that river was not as good as it was further up. And therefore, that shows the simplicity and therefore the elegance of a concept like Māori. And we can actually relate that a little bit to human health, because the reason that is paru is because there's a whole lot of activity going on, including from a pulp and paper mill that used to operate up in Kawero. And so this idea of Māori is also linked to human health. And if we just take a moment to think about human health, and I'm very, very, very simplifying it here, the concepts of tapu and noa, whereby everyone has tapu, varying amounts of tapu. Sometimes the chiefs had a bit more, but the tapu was at a level that it was safe to operate normally, and so that's at a noa level. When we became unwell, our tapu was elevated, and so that then sometimes if it was we were unwell enough, we were removed from everyone else in order to maintain the Māori, so that so the sickness didn't spread. So your Māori becomes impacted, you become unwell, your tapu is raised, and so then you are taken away in a form of kind of like a rāhui. And so we can think about rāhui in the environmental context too, and I'll come to that one in just a moment. But the point I want to make here is when the pulp and paper mill was operating, all the scientific evidence of the day says, yeah, those chemicals are okay, those chemicals are safe, those chemicals are fine. And so even though people who worked in those mills, and in fact, although I don't have relatives who worked in this one, I had relatives who worked in the Kinleith mill, a similar mill using similar processes over near Toitū. They would tell me about, really severe headaches and crawling and itching of the skin when they came in contact with these chemicals. And so in a Māori framing, their Māori was really poor from exposure to these chemicals. And even though now I believe there might be epidemiological evidence which links those chemicals with the intergenerational cancers we're seeing with such high prevalence in Kawero and in Tāne, and from those former sawmill workers, the key point is that Māori would have been an accurate framing for the health and well-being of those people. That's now 35, 40 years too late. So even though we have that really hard, precise information now in the form of epidemiological evidence, a Māori framing would have been accurate at that time and then proven to be just as precise, as we move through time. So there's one framing of Māori that starts to link it between the health of the environment and the health of people. Now, here's another thing that occurred most recently, and this is in the environment. We had the MV Rena ran aground on Tāne on the Astrolabe Reef, and it spilled a whole lot of oil. And, the impact was immediate in the environment. And so the health and well-being of the taia of these birds was severely impacted. Now, folks, if you felt anything when you saw this image, you know, we have a word for that, that you felt the mauri, you felt the impact of the mauri of those birds, and hence to the environment. And that can actually, you know, can manifest in ways in the health and well-being or the unhealth of people. And so hopefully I've expanded some of those ideas of mauri for you. And what actually happened there was a determination that part of the ship would be left on the reef, but that when you start to see images like this, that actually the mauri of that place bounced back really highly. Now, all the ecotoxic materials were moved, the copper, the heavy metals, the heavy fuel oil, that was all removed, and just pretty much steel was left. And although that's not pristine, we can see that's not really impacting the marine environment too much in this place. We did try and get a rahui for this, and that would have been amazing, but sadly, you know, some of the decision making didn't quite keep up with some of this thinking, which was so manifest, you know, because it was a no-go zone for some time while they removed as much of the wreck, and the mauri was restored. Didn't quite happen there, but it gave us some learnings, and we try to apply that elsewhere. And so one of those is in the form of rahui. So in the environment, when the mauri of an area becomes severely impacted, the tapu gets raised, and we can use an idea like rahui, a temporary restriction on activities in that space, designed to let the mauri recover. So remember, it's the mauri that's the trigger. The mauri gets impacted, the tapu gets raised, you put a rahui in there with the intent of allowing the taia to recover, and then when the taia has recovered, the mauri recovers, the tapu drops back down to a no level, there's no longer the requirement for the rahui. And so this is some of the framing, and this is some of the work actually, this I highlight here, a big endeavour project which is underway. I need to be clear, I'm a part of this project as well, where different haukainga groups have placed rahui with the express intent of you know, picking the mauri or picking te mauri or te moana, you know, really lifting the mauri of the moana. And in fact, even just in the ability for us to do that is actually picking up the mauri of the people, because they have a sense of agency and purpose in this space. And so I started with this image, and I said I would come back to it. And so here we are, whānau. One of the visions and some part of the visionary work of Ngāti Whātua Rākei is to try and restore the mauri to te whenua rangatira, restore the mauri to Okahu. And so te whenua rangatira are the lands that they've had returned to them. And of course, for those of you who are unaware, off screen, gosh, as I look at it to that side of the screen and up on the hill is Takaparafo, Bastion Point. And then so they have a plan to restore the land, restore the mauri to the land, collecting seeds, locally derived seeds from local bush, and recloaking papa tuanuku. Similarly, they have a plan to restore the mauri to the bay. And you can see this, the vision that came out of some community placemaking work there. You know, so that thriving marine ecosystems provide sustainable kaimoana resource. So we can actually go in and use techniques of science to understand, you know, are there kaimoana species there? Are there enough? Are they getting big enough to be harvested? Are the populations able to be sustained? Some harvesting. Are those mahinga kai species? And down here, it's mainly tuangi and pipi, although there are some mussels. We're doing some mussel work further out. You know, are they actually healthy to be kaimoana? And so these are the kind of questions that link with, you know, Toitū te marae o Tāne. Once we have recloaked papa tuanuku back up on the land, Toitū te marae o Tangaroa. Once we have enabled these populations of kaimoana to replenish, the seagrasses to come back and perform their functions, and we've got mussels further off. Now we're starting to see the dolphins and the orca are coming back into the bay. So there's a sense that the mauri is beginning to restore, and then in time, once all those have been, once all those restorative measures in the land and in the sea, on the seabed have taken place, then that will manifest in the life and the health and well-being of the people. So whānau, hopefully that's given you just a little bit more of an insight into some Māori framings of the aspirations of this conference and the dream, which I strongly adhere with and support, taia, tangata hauora, advancing planetary health. If we can draw from those Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing, I think we'll be in a much better place. And so just to close on two things, one of the most amazing learnings I've had in my time is actually this idea of be a good ancestor. And that means living up to those all those responsibilities of a good kaitiaki. And also the final one is that if we recognise that Indigenous ways of knowing and being doing are going to contribute so well to advancing planetary health, it's a good reminder for us all that we're all Indigenous to this planet. Nō reira, kia ora mai tātou katoa, and I look forward to any pātai. Kia ora.